Hey Jordan, how you going?
Good, Arch. How are you?
Pretty good. I'm doing well. There is a lot going on this week. There have been
Yeah,
some big conversations happening around all the stuff we love about, privacy and online safety and digital issues. So, a lot to get into.
indeed. Many in the last day or two.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. Should we start? We got to start with online defamation. There's a very recent announcement from the federal government that a new crusade to unmask anonymous commenters online and that make defamatory posts, which is also linked to um, a broader swipe at big tech, I suppose, from the federal government. The next one, which is a parliamentary inquiry into social media and online safety. Um, just announced in the last couple of days. The interesting bit from our point of view that I wanted to talk to you about is these proposed laws to require social media platforms to collect the real names, phone numbers, and email addresses of their users, and to essentially make them available to courts in defamation proceedings. So there'd be a complaint mechanism that a social media platform has to have in place where you could voluntarily unmask yourself, and then failing that, if a person institutes proceedings, the courts could access real name, contact details in order to support the victim's defamation proceedings. The mechanism is a funny one as well in Australia. Anyway, it's a kind of American Section 230 argument, or where you would, unless social media platforms do this, they would be designated as the publishers of those comments, so they themselves would be liable for that kind of defamation claim. So yeah, it's a funny one. What were your thoughts? This approach of online safety through defamation.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's pretty much the neat summary of it. I mean, I think, it's like with many of these things around online safety or social media generally, they're all framed in, very broad terms around sort of a whole category of harms and ills that these platforms represent. And then, the prescription often is sort of one obscure or one very specific thing. And so, online safety through defamation is a neat summary because, when this was announced, it was kind of speaking to toxicity and the prime minister sort of spoke to sort of the harassment and bullying and sledging, and then this is the sort of stuff we need to clean up these online environments through social media. But as you say, it is very, very expressly focused around defamation, which is a very sort of narrow and curious way to address that bigger problem. And I think when you look at the sort of exposure draft, you start to get a sense that it is not about all of what is wrong with social media, and even all of what is wrong in terms of people's experiences of harassment or abuse. It is very much specifically about one category of toxicity around sort of defamatory comments, and it is also very specifically about shifting responsibility for that kind of defamation, liability for that defamation, from one group of organizations to another, that being from media to social media. Because if you look at the framing of the bill, it's very explicitly, despite what the may have been said at press conferences by the government when they announced it being about a bigger thing, the bill itself speaks very specifically to being a reaction against the Bill and Voller case, which essentially put the responsibility for defamatory comments on sort of media companies' social media pages on the media companies themselves. So where maybe previously the media companies might have said, well, that's on our Facebook page, it's Facebook. It was the Voller case said, well, actually, that the media companies were responsibility. And this reform, these proposed laws explicitly address that and tackle that by saying, well, actually, we're going to push the responsibility back onto the social media companies. We're going to, take the liability away from the media companies. So it's, when you start to sort of unpick it and dig into it, it's a lot more specific. And to me, it brought for me memories of the sort of the news media bargaining code, which was kind of, perhaps the government's first or sort of first notable foray into sort of reforms against the social media companies. And, it was the first thing they did sort of on the back of the digital platforms inquiry. And it was sort of positioned as, okay, finally we're tackling big tech. We're tackling the social media companies with some reforms and regulations. But the news media bargaining code was, again, very specifically about a set of grievances that the media companies had about the way their published content was being used and distributed on social media without them getting a financial benefit for it. And so the news media bargaining code tackled that for the benefit of the media companies, particularly the bigger ones, and did really nothing to address a lot of the other issues that we talk about when it comes to social media, particularly around, monetization of our personal data and so on and so forth. So I think, what I'm seeing here is really they're pushing responsibility back through this legislation from the media companies onto the social media companies around defamation.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point you make in that analysis. The link to the news media bargaining code, right? And I remember us talking about this at the time of the news media bargaining code, about being concerned that that in the public debate where we're saying the selling of that and it seems like this defamation law is framed around these broader, we're pushing back against the big tech companies, and we're fighting for online safety, pushing back against these monopolies. But in fact, the actual, you're spending the broader political capital for a very focused, very specific solution, which only really benefits a few small, the people who have access and resources to push a defamation claim. But so I think that's a really interesting point, but I want to push back on the shifting of liability or responsibility onto the social media companies, because I mean they have to do something. If this law gets passed, they'll have to collect people's information, but it really shifts the cost, I think, on the individual. It takes it away from the media company, from which was the result of the Voller case, that. And pushes it onto individuals to, they're bearing the cost of having to provide their details in case they provide they defame someone and ultimately have to be prosecuted, which is going to be such a tiny proportion of the people on social media. But so people are bearing this privacy cost in order to defend against online defamation, and individuals are bearing the cost of policing speech about them online, right? The defamation law is, tremendous. I mean, the courts generally are tremendously expensive and inaccessible. I think there's some idea in this law that the Attorney General might help people bring defamation claims, but it's not an accessible mechanism for 99% of the population. It's not a practical way to control speech online. In fact, the outcome of the Voller case, where which put media companies on notice to make sure that they're to moderate their comment sections and to make sure that they're civil and not defamatory, and not in the case of the Voller case in particular, quite vile and abusive. Putting that obligation on the owners of the communities in which the comments are made seems to me like a much more sensible, much more appropriate position. Maybe that's unsympathetic because I don't run a news media company or something and don't appreciate the costs of managing and moderating. But yeah, I think it ultimately puts a lot more cost on. It's ultimately shifting costs from from news media companies or the managers of communities onto the members of the communities to police through the courts, rather than the manager of the community to police through moderation of that community, which I think's, problematic. I also just hate the framing of online problems with online discourse as a problem with anonymity, which is just not. The claim that the solution to all our the problems of civility and toxicity in online discourse is, well, at least if everybody was operating under their real name. Most of the horrible comments that happen on Facebook are under people's real names. A lot of the toxicity online's legitimately just people being awful to each other and being fully identified. So
totally.
Anyway,
I mean,
problematic on both. Yeah.
I think so. I think I found the anonymity issue, even as it relates to defamation, a bit curious. I mean, I did kind of wonder of I guess how truly defamatory it is to get, called out by someone who's anonymous. I mean, what is the stature of that person online that is somehow having a major impact on someone else's reputation?
It's a good point, right?
Yeah.
Defamation is about reputation, not about abuse, right? And if a person is some anonymous troll, and we can all agree on that, then what's the reputational harm?
Exactly. Like if Mike17342 with an egg-shaped icon calls you something, I mean, how truly defamatory is that? I mean, it was deliciously ironic that when announcing this very measure, some random people walked behind the Prime Minister and during his press conference and yelled out "liar, liar," and it was almost sort of symbolic. It was like, who are they, and so what stature does what status does their comment have, and when you parallel that online. So even as it goes to defamation, I think anonymity is not necessarily at the heart of it. And then when you talk more broadly about toxicity on these platforms, the scope of what makes social media toxic, it has a lot more to do with defamatory comments. It's about just outright abuse. It's about the way the platforms are set up to amplify outrage. It's the pylon. It's the fact not just that a particular anonymous person is saying something, but it's the ability for like negative sentiment, for people to pile on and direct that at people. These are the things that I think contribute to toxicity, and I don't think this reform does anything to address that. We need
exactly. I think it's in fact harmful, right? And again, like just coming back to the news media bargaining code, it's taking a problem that we all agree is an issue and framing this thing as a solution, which is not a solution to that problem. It's a solution to a very specific set of, wealthy, privileged individuals' concerns. Like the only people who benefit from this are the kind of people who might pursue a defamation claim, right? Which are overwhelmingly like people, public figures with significant resources, or others with significant resources. 99% of people don't benefit from this. It doesn't solve the toxicity problem, and so we're burning the concern, the political capital that exists in relation to the toxicity problem on something
exactly.
That's not gonna fix it.
How much we have to ask the question for how much appetite and energy will these are tough battles to go in up against these big tech companies and social media platforms. How much capital does government have? How much appetite does it have to keep going and proposing these reforms? And given that that's probably limited, let's focus on the things that matter. And it's even worse than that. I think it's not just that the policy in this case is not effective. It's that, as we see in this space, in this complex space of sort of online regulation and tech policy, there are side effects. There are bad side effects to bad policy. So, there's a great kind of comparison that we could look at around South Korea, which introduced exactly this measure back in 2007, so that all users of sites that had more than 300,000 visitors had to be identified. And so they introduced that measure, and again, the sort of the rationale was the same. It was around abuse and kind of defamatory comments. But having introduced it, they went off and studied what was the effect, and it had no really decrease in the amount of online abuse, and it didn't prevent misinformation. So it wasn't effective. But worse than that, it was struck down eventually by their constitutional court for being unconstitutional, because it was being seen to discourage people from criticizing influential people on these online platforms for fear of punishment. So, you know, it had a really bad adverse effect in terms of freedom of speech. And then that's to say nothing of, you know, what we know to be the importance of anonymity for, you know, people who are in marginalized communities or who just fear, you know, fear being identified. But, you know, victims of domestic violence, you know, people who are in maybe politically disenfranchised groups who want to have a voice, this can have a chilling effect on their ability to participate. And there was a great sort of quote that came out of the, you know, the Constitutional Court's ruling in Korea, which was, even if there is a side effect to online anonymity, it should be strongly protected for its constitutional value, which, you know, sums up that, okay, one, this is a narrow set of things you're trying to address, but even if we are trying to address, you know, anonymity as it relates to defamation, the impact of doing that is the adverse impact of doing that is not something we should take on, given its impact on constitutional rights like freedom of speech and all that. So I think it's a bundle of bad, frankly.
Yeah, it doesn't work. Even if it did work, we shouldn't do it. Is that summary? I mean, yeah, I agree. And you know, the justification, the policy justification seems to be, it seems to be, again, I've said this a couple of times, but it's tying on to this like public outrage, right? And the fear and discomfort about trolls online, and without any real like well-defined specific policy justification, right? Like it'd be nice to see us dig into, you know, like that South Korean example. You know, what are the costs? What are the benefits? Who does this? What are the actual practical outcomes? Is this just a, you know, controlling, chilling speech about high-profile individuals? You know, there was a survey in the SMH that that said, you know, seemed to indicate that a lot of people were, you know, 2/3 of Australian adults back the idea of holding Facebook and other social media companies responsible for posts made on their platforms. I mean, again, I don't think that's what this law does. This law, well, it only does that if they refuse to collect identifying details. And 70% of people want anonymous trolls to be revealed. And again, you know, it's not, I don't know, I think it's problematic to just rely on it, or to be citing a survey general public attitudes, because, you know, yeah, I think if you present the general public with, or the responses to those surveys with this like very good evidence that most of the online trolls are unmasked and it doesn't really make a difference, and you present them with the difficulties with these policy positions and the complexities, you know, I'm not sure that that's going to be the outcome. There's kind of this, you know, you got to rely on public opinion directionally. Where do we need to go with policy? But like in terms of the specific outcomes.
And the solution. Yeah. I mean, the solution, I think, requires a bit more, you know, considered expert kind of input, and, you know, looking to other jurisdictions, like you say. And it's a bit problematic, I think, particularly when we're talking about, like in the Korea case found, we're talking about constitutional rights. We're talking about a broader set of rights. You know, going to the mob and saying, well, here's what the mob think, that we should just do this when there are these after effects and side effects, is problematic.
Yeah, the mob supports it, right? Because it's a plausible solution, but we've tried it, and in fact, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
You know, you need to add that layer. I also thought it was, you know, it's funny turning to the populace, turning to the faceless mob, on, you know, for opinions about what to do about a different faceless mob. The survey faceless mob has opinions on what to do for the online faceless mob.
Exactly.
Yeah. Anyway, entertaining. Let's move on. Let's let's go to the UK, Clearview. So the UK Information Commissioner Elizabeth Denham this week announced that she intended to fine Clearview AI £17 million, about 31 million Australian, for breaches of the UK data protection laws. You know, we'll remember that Clearview AI is this kind of facial recognition startup, scrapes photos from publicly available sources, social media networks and online repositories, that kind of thing, and runs facial recognition on it, then sells that to law enforcement to, you know, if you've got a photo, they'll point to use their facial recognition algorithms to point to a publicly available photo of that person. Or, you know,
and so this was sort of almost like the second half of what was actually a joint investigation with the Australian Information Commissioner, the OAIC. So the OAIC and the ICO in the UK announced in July 2020 that they were going to be looking into Clearview AI. And a couple of weeks ago, the OAIC put its determination out, which we actually chatted about, and you know, it made the news. So Australia made the news globally around this for good reasons. And the OAIC found that Clearview was in breach of Australian law, and had ordered them to stop collecting images and biometric templates from individuals in Australia, and to destroy all the existing images and templates they had collected in Australia. So yeah, like I said, that was a strong stance from our Information Commissioner. What I guess it was interesting to see that the ICO's announcement this week is also good, because they're part of the same package of investigations. But there wasn't a fine in the Australian announcement. I mean, that was the big thing that jumped out about this one, was like, not only is it a strong statement against what Clearview AI are doing, but the ICO are going to hit them with a £17 million fine. Why? I mean, what's your take? Why didn't we find them in Australia?
It's really interesting, right? Because yeah, you look at this joint investigation, very similar findings in terms, I mean, different laws, but very similar findings, very strong statements from both regulators that, you know, this kind of activity is, you know, extremely harmful to privacy, puts people at very significant risk, in terms of, particularly through like misidentification and over enforcement and bias and all of these issues. You know, so really damning opinions. And then the UK one ends with a $30 million fine, and the Australia one ends with a stern reprimand. I think there are a couple reasons, and the first is simply that the maximum fine in Australia is $2.2 million at the moment. So even if there had been a fine to the maximum in Australia, it's 2.2. We certainly can't go to that kind of 30 million plus level. But, you know, I mean, fine would have been warranted in my view anyway. I think the second one is a practical one. In Australia, the second reason, in Australia, the OAIC does not have a power to levy fines directly. They have to apply to the federal court for a civil penalty order. The federal court can agree to initiate to issue that order, but essentially the OAIC has to prove their case to the federal court. Whereas in the UK, I don't think that's the case. My understanding in the UK is just the commissioner, Elizabeth, can just fine people. I mean, I'm sure there's processes around it. There are processes around it, but there's not that same requirement to go to the federal court, and that's a real limitation. You know, the OAIC's been in federal court with Facebook for at least a year now, about Cambridge Analytica stuff, which happened back in 2018, the Cambridge Analytica scandal.
noting
a
that they're a
relatively
lean. Yeah, sorry, I was about to say they're
yeah,
a very small and lean operation.
they're a small organization. They just don't have the funds to pursue many or multiple federal court matters at the same time. I mean, the OAIC hasn't said that that's the reason, and they don't provide much of a justification around whether or not they'd be seeking damages. They might still. I think they could still. I'm not sure. Maybe they couldn't. But so there's not a clear statement from the OAIC as to whether that's the case, but I do think that's it. They just don't have the resources, and they'd probably spend honestly $2 million plus seeking to claw back a $2 million fine. I don't think. Yeah. Anyway, I think it's really problematic. The structure of those penalties in Australia at the moment, the funding of the OAIC. I'd note that both of those issues, the funding of the OAIC and the volume of the penalty amounts, are live discussions around reform at the moment. So there are proposals in the Privacy Act review discussion paper for different models of funding, an industry levy, or just improved government funding for the OAIC to make sure that they do have the resources to pursue these kinds of actions. And there's also a proposed bill at the moment the online privacy bill that would up the penalties to a maximum to align with consumer protection laws, which is $10 million fines, or 10% of your Australian revenue, or 3 times the benefit you got from the breach. So I think, I think there's sorry?
Better days ahead, we hope. With
better
regards
days
to,
ahead.
and like, I think, that I think we can certainly take from it. I think there's some good in the sort of sense of alignment and reinforcement by the kind of these respective regulators working together on investigations like this, putting out kind of consistent statements and views on the technologies like this, and then hopefully we can kind of also see, as you said, an uplift in our local regulators' ability to sort of levy fines and pursue regulatory action. So I think that'd be a good thing to see. Yeah. I was keen to kind of move on to another topic, Jordan. We were slightly sort of adjacent, maybe a little bit different to what we've just discussed, but the Senate this week put out a report into the Australian Public Service, which was quite damning about the use of external contractors, particularly around ICT projects and skill sets, and more specifically around the use of those contractors for what they called core ongoing work. So there's this sort of labelling of the hollowing out of the Australian Public Service through the use of these external contractors. And there were some really interesting findings in this that I thought we should talk about, because they have, I think, implications for technology policy and even sort of privacy and security initiatives. But one of them was that there are now more temporary contract workers in government technology projects than full-time APS staff, which is quite
That's
stark.
an amazing statistic.
Yeah, and then kind of related to that is that the report found that there's close to $1.2 billion was spent in 1 year with just 8 private consulting firms in a largely unaccountable way for work that the report said should have been completed in-house by the APS. So, as I said, clearly, like the kind of conclusion from these kind of behaviours is that we're hollowing out the public services ICT skill set and the ability to sort of use taxpayer money efficiently. So that this has kind of prompted a bunch of things. One is very much around sort of how do we reinvigorate the ability of the public service to do these sort of projects and to build better career pathways to attract technology talent, attract workers to the public service. But I mean, it's a bit of a tough one, because I mean, in some cases I think it's legitimate to go to consulting companies. In some cases, you should use your in-house. How do you sort of parse that?
I mean, I'm conscious that we are a consulting company,
Right.
right? So I'm going to tell you that, you know, outsourcing is totally legitimate, and there, I mean, there are very good reasons for outsourcing, right? There are very good reasons to not try to build an internal capability for a particular function. You know, that it might be because you can't, you know, this is something we see a lot in kind of privacy cybersecurity. Is it's a really hot market. There's a lot of demand for people with skills and experience, and it can be really hard to get and retain staff with those skills. So, you know, it might well be, we've seen clients that have sought to build internal teams and really struggled, and so, you know, decided to push some of that work to us, for example. So, you know, so there's that's one potential reason. Another is that, like, a lot of the time it just doesn't make sense, right, to have really deep specific expertise in a particular topic that you probably won't use for, you know, for the majority of the year, but you've got this like really strong capability. So like an example of that is like incident response, right? Privacy, data breach response, and incident response teams around that for privacy or security or forensics that flow in after a major data breach. For a lot of companies, it doesn't make sense to build that capability in-house. There's relatively mature services you can just ring in to do it, and hopefully it's only happening, you know, once every few years, in that kind of major incidents kind of sense. So, you know, I think there are very good reasons for outsourcing, but yeah, I mean, looking at that report, I can only agree with the, you know, the statements there that, you know, it should be a last resort. It should be, you know, you shouldn't be relying on, and the Australian Public Service shouldn't be relying on contractors so deeply for just the core business of an organization or of the public service. You know, when the more that it's a kind of really damaging cycle as well, right? The more you push the work out, the less internal capability, the less ability you have to do it yourself, and it just kind of, yeah, it's a vicious cycle. But yeah, what was your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think when it comes to sort of the capabilities, like you say, there's a spectrum of things that are maybe more strategic, more niche, more specialist that warrant going outside, and then there are particularly the sort of descriptions around kind of core, you know, sort of core standard kind of work. Putting that outside the organization seems unnecessary. I had sort of two sort of reflections on this, particularly in relation to the sort of work we're doing around kind of privacy, security. And one was that a lot of the focus of the work and the sort of the success, making these projects succeed around security transformations, privacy transformation, a lot of it comes down to shaping kind of internal culture and embedding things within DNA. And I do have a concern sometimes that if you view these projects purely in terms of just like there's a capability or there's a thing that needs to be implemented, and then, you know, people can do that and go away, you're not tackling that cultural transformation that needs to happen. And so we talk a lot about, you know, these things that kind of being by design and embedded. And I think that requires at least some level of commitment to building your own internal workforce and capability who can, you know, really make those practices part of the DNA. Because a lot of the challenge with making kind of things like privacy and security part of an organization's DNA, whether that's a private sector organization or a public sector, is to sort of weave those missions around privacy and security into the broader kind of value set of the organization. You know, and it requires kind of leaders to sort of be able to go out and talk to other parts of the business, of the other parts of the organization, and sort of make it become organically part of the way you do things. And I think a lot of that comes down to someone within your own organization speaking to you in terms of, in the language and the culture and the value set of your organization. So that, I mean, it's a bit fluffy,
Yeah.
but I think there's
Yeah.
a real risk in saying this entire kind of concern around privacy or security is something we'll go to an external consultant to come in and deliver into us and potentially leave. And so,
yeah, and it's not something I have to deal with, right? Or I have to think about. I don't have to change my behavior. We've got a specialist for that.
yeah, exactly. So I think, when you think about those projects, it's important not just to think of them as sort of delivered capabilities. Sometimes it's about, well, what am I trying to build within my organization? What kind of culture, what tone, what DNA am I trying to sort of shape? So that I think would then change the calculus when you think about contractors. And the other sort of perspective on this, I think, is, as we have talked about a lot in these conversations, a lot of these projects, a lot of these, um, technology initiatives have a really big public policy aspect to them. These are things that impact the way citizens interact with government and interact with each other. And so there's a real lens around sort of, public policy and what is in the interest of the nation and the citizenship. It's not just about delivered capability and expertise. And I feel like, this might be a naive view, but I feel like that's what the APS is heavily geared around being. It's about this organization that has the ability to give fearless and frank advice into sort of the executive, but also has this broad public policy lens, which may not necessarily always exist if you're just going out to sort of the specialist skilled external contractor to come in and deliver something. So I think, in the design of these projects, the design of these initiatives around ICT work and technology projects, I think the APS has actually a lot of value to add. And that's the other part of this, I would add.
Yeah, I think that's right on. I spent the most of the start of my career in the public service, and it's a little less so now, but like there is still a sense that the word public servant, right? There is a duty, there's a expectation that people working in the public service are servants of the public interest. That is your job, and that does put them in distinction to a contractor who comes in, or working in the private sector where you're much more economic, financial kind of interests. So yeah, I think that's a really good point, that it's not just about the finances in the practical sense and the internal capability is relevant, but I think also just in a really principled way, who is doing the job is relevant, and what they're, whether they are a member of the public service working in the public interest, or a contractor who is still doing the right work, but not with that kind of fundamental motivation.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, that's been another good conversation. I've enjoyed that. I mean, I think, like you say, I think there's hopefully better days ahead in both those realms, like whether it's sort of the regulatory sphere with kind of, the reforms coming, but also there have been kind of various reports like this into the public service. And as we sort of talk more and more about kind of technology initiatives coming out of government, that this will hopefully be, something that's front of mind, is like, how can we equip these bodies to actually get this stuff right, because it has consequences.
No, there's some good stories. I mean, I'm hopeful for the Privacy Act reform. I'm less hopeful for the defamation laws. As someone said on Twitter, it'd be nice if Australia could be leading the world with good technology policy, not insane technology policy. But oh well.
We will hope that the next time we have this conversation, that we're getting kind of patted on the back all around the world for something, rather than what we saw this week, which is some fairly hefty criticism. But until then, I guess we'll live in hope.
We'll live in hope.
All right. Thanks, Jordan.
Talk to you next time.
See you next time. Bye.